I received my late grandmother's mysterious diary for my birthday, which told of a secret inheritance and my lost sister with ties to crime. It was my 30th birthday. I wasn't expecting much, my family never made a big deal of birthdays. Over the years, I'd learned to keep my expectations low. A quick, happy birthday, text or maybe a call, and that was it. I had a quiet dinner planned with a couple of friends, nothing fancy, just another day, really. But then a plain brown package arrived on my doorstep. No return address, but the handwriting on the tag stopped me cold. It was from my father. My estranged father. The man who had walked out of our lives almost a decade ago without so much as a backward glance. I hadn't heard from him since. My hands shook as I picked it up, feeling the weight of what might be inside. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, I found a worn leather-bound diary. The initials, ML, were engraved on the cover in gold. My heart sank and raced at the same time. Those were my grandmother's initials, my late grandmother, the one my father had always idolized but never talked about much. She'd passed when I was 15, leaving behind an air of mystery and a family that never fully healed. I flipped through the pages, the scent of aged paper filling the air. The handwriting was hers, unmistakably. Memories of her quiet strength and gentle wisdom flooded back as I skimmed through entries. Then, a particular page caught my eye. The ink was bold, underlined in places, as if she'd wanted to make sure no one misunderstood. It spoke of an inheritance. Not just money, but a legacy, a lake house, rare art, and an investment portfolio. But this fortune wasn't meant for just anyone. It was for the true heir of the family. And according to my grandmother, that person wasn't my father. The revelation sent chills down my spine. My family had always struggled with money, or so I thought. Yet, here was proof of a hidden fortune, and even more shocking, I was not the only one it could belong to. The diary revealed something else, a sibling. A sister, born years before me, given up for adoption. I sat there in stunned silence, the diary trembling in my hands. I had so many questions. Who was she? Why had my parents kept her a secret? And why now? Why was my father giving this to me? What was he expecting me to do? Little did I know, opening that package was the first step into a labyrinth of family secrets that would change my life forever. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The diary's presence felt almost suffocating, its weight both literal and metaphorical. Each time I reread the pages, one phrase reverberated louder than the rest. Your parents made a choice we could never understand, and now it's up to the true heir to set things right. By morning, the urge for answers had grown unbearable. My mother and I didn't share the closest bond, but she was the only person left who might explain what the diary had revealed. The idea of calling her made my chest tighten, but the alternative, remaining in the dark, was worse. When she picked up, there was a brief pause of surprise in her tone. We didn't talk often, and I knew she wasn't expecting this. I didn't waste time with small talk. I brought up the diary and what I had learned. The moment the words, hidden sibling, left my lips, the silence on her end became almost deafening. Her reaction wasn't anger, at least not at first, but a deep, palpable unease. She tried to deflect, dismissing my questions with vague statements about things I couldn't understand. When I pressed harder, a crack appeared in her facade. My father's role in this mystery loomed large in her voice, bitterness seeping through as she mentioned his reckless decisions and unnecessary risks. She warned me in no uncertain terms, pursuing this would bring nothing but danger. The word danger sent a chill down my spine. She didn't elaborate much, only hinting at the family who had adopted my sibling. They weren't the people my parents had believed them to be. Complications, she called it, her voice trembling slightly as she said the word. The more she talked, the more my frustration grew. She wanted me to drop it, to pretend this truth didn't exist. But her evasiveness only solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about me, it was about a sister I'd never known and a legacy my grandmother had entrusted me to uncover. When I told her I wouldn't let it go, her tone shifted sharply. She accused me of being reckless, of making the same mistakes as my father. But buried beneath her anger, I sensed something else, fear. For me, for what might happen if I followed this thread too far. She ended the conversation abruptly, leaving me with a final warning. If I chose to keep digging, I was on my own. The call left me shaken but determined. Her refusal to answer only confirmed what I already knew. There was something bigger at play, something my family had been hiding for years. My mother might have been content to leave it buried, but I wasn't. I stared at the diary, its worn leather cover holding secrets that could no longer remain closed. Whatever my grandmother had wanted me to uncover, I would. Even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The name in the margins, AG, Trust and Estates, had been easy to overlook at first. But the more I stared at the diary, the more certain I became that it was a clue left deliberately by my grandmother. It was the only concrete lead I had, so I followed it. A few online searches later, I found Alan Grayson, an estate lawyer operating out of a small, unassuming office 2 towns over. The law firm's modesty didn't inspire much confidence, but as soon as I introduced myself, the atmosphere changed. Grayson, a young and sharp-eyed professional, greeted me with a sense of familiarity. He recognized my name immediately. According to him, my grandmother had spoken about me frequently. She had entrusted him with setting up the legal framework for the inheritance, a process she'd handled with great care. It was strange to think that she'd involved someone I'd never met in matters so personal, but it was also oddly comforting. As Grayson laid out the details, the story from the diary began to take shape with chilling clarity. My grandmother had always intended the inheritance for someone she called the true heir, a title she had used deliberately. That heir wasn't my father. It wasn't me either. It was my sibling, the sister my parents had given up for adoption years before I was born. The inheritance was more than money, it was a form of protection. My grandmother had been aware of the shady connections surrounding the family that adopted my sibling. She had structured the assets, valuable artwork, the lake house, and a significant financial portfolio, not just as a legacy, but as a lure. If my sister ever came forward to claim her inheritance, it would serve as a way to shield her from those who might exploit or harm her. But there was a catch. For the inheritance to be claimed, it would require her physical presence. Grayson's voice turned serious as he explained the risks. My grandmother's suspicions about the adoptive family hadn't been unfounded. Over the years, their name had surfaced in connection with fraud, laundering, and worse. If they became aware of the inheritance, or of my search for my sister, they wouldn't hesitate to act. It felt like a punch to the gut. Everything about the situation was fraught with risk, not just for my sister, but for me as well. And yet, I couldn't ignore the feeling that my grandmother had intended me to take this step. Before I left, Grayson handed me an envelope, its seal unbroken and my grandmother's handwriting scrawled across its surface. She had left it specifically for me, a final piece of guidance that might clarify what I needed to do next. As I walked out of the office, my thoughts swirled. The implications were overwhelming: hidden dangers, my father's involvement, the possibility that I was just another pawn in his plans. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, a question burned brighter than the rest: was I ready to risk everything to uncover the truth about my sister? The envelope sat heavy in my hands as I left. Whatever it contained, I knew it would only push me further into the unknown. The envelope felt heavier than it should, its significance far outweighing its physical form. Sitting in my car outside the lawyer's office, I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in my grandmother's unmistakable, deliberate handwriting. Her words were personal, acknowledging the years of neglect I'd endured and confirming what I already knew about the inheritance. It was meant for my sibling. She revealed that she had tried to stop my parents from giving my sister up for adoption, but their minds had been made up. My father's impulsiveness and my mother's compliance had set everything into motion. What I hadn't known was that my grandmother had spent years tracking the adoptive family. Her notes painted a darker picture, connecting them to criminal activity. The inheritance, she explained, wasn't just a gift but a safeguard, designed to help my sister escape if she ever needed to. The lake house, in particular, was more than a retreat, it was a fortified haven. The letter also warned me about my father. He hadn't sent the diary out of guilt or reconciliation but desperation. He was using me, just as he had tried to use the inheritance years ago. Her closing words were a mix of encouragement and caution. She believed in my strength but made it clear the decision was mine alone, whether to walk away or risk everything to uncover the truth. The weight of her words left me reeling. My father's betrayal stung, but the responsibility my grandmother had placed in my hands felt heavier. For the first time, I fully understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The choice before me was no longer abstract, it was now painfully real. The letter left no room for hesitation. My grandmother's faith in me was clear, but so was the danger of moving forward. Yet, walking away wasn't an option, not after learning so much. I opened the diary again, searching for the breadcrumb trail she had left behind. One entry stood out, a mention of a lockbox stored at the bank where my grandparents had always conducted their business. The instructions were precise, detailing a key hidden in the old grandfather clock at the lake house. It was a cryptic but unmistakable lead. The lake house loomed in my mind as both a destination and a challenge. My grandmother had described it as a fortress, designed to protect its occupants. I hadn't visited since I was a child, but I remembered enough to know the house wouldn't give up its secrets easily. Reaching the lake house meant dealing with layers of emotional and physical barriers. My father's departure had left the property untouched, but the idea of stepping into that forgotten world felt heavy. Despite the apprehension, I couldn't ignore the possibility that the key to my sister's whereabouts, or at least the next step, was waiting there. The drive was long and lonely, giving me too much time to second-guess my decision. Memories of the lake house crept back, summers spent on the dock, my grandmother's quiet presence as she read by the fire, and the strained silences whenever my father was around. Arriving at the property, I was struck by how much it had decayed. The shutters hung crookedly, and the driveway was overrun with weeds. Yet, the place still exuded an air of defiance, as if daring anyone to unlock its mysteries. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, dust coating every surface like a shroud. The grandfather clock stood where I remembered it, tall and imposing in the corner of the living room. Opening its hollow base, I found the key exactly as my grandmother had described. Holding it, I felt a sense of purpose take root. This was just the beginning, but it was enough to fuel me forward. My grandmother's lockbox was waiting, and with it, the next piece of a puzzle that was quickly becoming my obsession. With the key from the lake house in hand, I made my way to the bank my grandparents had used for decades. It was a small, unassuming building, the kind that hadn't changed much over the years. Stepping inside, I felt a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. The clerk barely glanced at me as I presented the key and identification. After some routine formalities, I was led to a private room where the lockbox waited. It was larger than I expected, its metal surface worn but sturdy, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. Opening it, I was met with an assortment of items, a bundle of aged documents tied with a ribbon, an envelope marked with my sister's name, and a small velvet pouch. Each piece felt like a step deeper into the labyrinth of my family's secrets. The documents were the first thing I examined. They were meticulous records my grandmother had kept about the adoptive family. Dates, names, addresses, all catalogued with precision. She had tracked them from the moment my sister left, watching as their seemingly perfect facade began to crack. The criminal connections she'd hinted at in her letter were laid bare, painting a picture of a family entangled in dangerous dealings. Next was the envelope. It was sealed and bore only my sister's name, written in my grandmother's careful script. I resisted the urge to open it, knowing it wasn't meant for me. Instead, I placed it carefully aside, its presence both reassuring and ominous. Finally, the velvet pouch. Inside was a small gold locket, engraved with initials I didn't recognize. When I opened it, there was a photograph of a baby girl, my sister. The sight of her tiny face, innocent and unaware of the life she was about to be thrust into, made my chest tighten. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note from my grandmother. It was brief, more like instructions than a message. She directed me to a lawyer in another state, someone she trusted to help me connect the pieces. There was also a warning: once I reached out, there would be no turning back. As I locked the box and left the bank, the weight of the locket in my pocket felt heavier than it should. The pieces were coming together, but each new revelation only deepened the sense of urgency. Somewhere out there, my sister was living a life she didn't choose, and it was clear that finding her would mean walking straight into the storm my grandmother had tried to shield us from. The note from my grandmother directed me to a lawyer named Evelyn Clark, someone she described as an ally who could help navigate the next steps. The address was for a small town in another state, a place I'd never heard of before. The drive there was quiet and contemplative, the locket from the lockbox resting in my pocket like an anchor. Evelyn's office was tucked in a corner of an old brick building, its simple brass plaque the only indication of her practice. She was older, with a composed demeanor that exuded quiet authority. When I mentioned my grandmother's name, something shifted in her expression, a mix of recognition and caution. She led me to her office, where shelves of legal books lined the walls. As I explained what had brought me there, her focus never wavered. She listened carefully, nodding as I recounted the details from the diary, the letter, and the lockbox. Evelyn confirmed much of what I already knew. She had worked with my grandmother for years, helping to establish the trust and safeguard the inheritance. But her knowledge went deeper. She was familiar with the adoptive family's darker dealings and had been involved in quiet efforts to ensure their activities didn't directly threaten my sister. The inheritance, she explained, was more than just a financial lifeline. It was a legal claim that would allow my sister to sever any ties to her adoptive family if she chose to. But that power came with risks. If they discovered the existence of the inheritance, they could use it as leverage, or worse, as a way to draw her back into their control. Evelyn revealed another detail that caught me off guard: my sister's last known location. My grandmother had managed to track her to a city on the other side of the country. She'd been living under a different name, possibly to escape the influence of her adoptive family. The address was years old, but it was the first tangible lead I'd had. Before I left, Evelyn handed me a folder containing additional documents, legal frameworks my grandmother had set up to protect both my sister and me. She warned me to move carefully, to avoid drawing attention until I was certain of my next steps. The adoptive family had eyes everywhere, and any misstep could put us both in danger. As I walked out of Evelyn's office, the weight of the task ahead pressed down on me. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was one of risk and uncertainty. My sister was out there, somewhere, and finding her meant stepping into a world my grandmother had spent years trying to shield me from. The address Evelyn had given me wasn't close, several states away, in a city I'd never visited. It was an old lead, years out of date, but it was the first concrete direction in a journey that had so far been shrouded in uncertainty. I packed the essentials, including the folder of documents, the locket, and the sealed envelope bearing my sister's name, and began the long drive. The hours passed slowly as I imagined what I might find. Would she still be there, or had she moved on? Did she even know about her connection to me, to the family we shared? The questions churned in my mind, each one fueling the determination to see this through. The address led to a modest apartment complex in a quiet part of the city. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, the air filled with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I approached the building with my heart pounding, scanning the names on the mailboxes for anything familiar. One stood out, L. Daniels. The initials didn't match the name I knew from the documents, but something about it felt right. My sister might have changed her name to escape her past, and if so, this could be her. I hesitated before knocking on the door listed for the apartment. My mind raced with possibilities. What if I was wrong, or worse, what if I was right? Finally, I mustered the courage and knocked softly. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman in her late 20s. Her eyes were wary but kind, her posture guarded. She didn't look like anyone from my family, but there was something familiar in the way she tilted her head, something I couldn't quite place. I introduced myself cautiously, using my first name only, and mentioned the connection to my grandmother. Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she quickly masked it. She didn't invite me in, but she didn't close the door either. She asked how I'd found her, her voice calm but tinged with suspicion. I explained the diary, the lockbox, and the years my grandmother had spent trying to protect her. When I mentioned the locket and the sealed envelope, her eyes softened just enough to suggest she knew what they were. The conversation was brief, her responses measured. She admitted she'd known she was adopted but claimed she'd never dug into the details. Her tone suggested this wasn't entirely true, but I didn't press her. She didn't confirm or deny being my sister, leaving me with more questions than answers. Before closing the door, she said something that lingered with me long after I left. You don't know what you're stepping into. Be careful. I returned to my car, the weight of her words heavy in the silence. If this was my sister, and I was almost certain it was, she clearly wasn't ready to let me in. For now, all I could do was respect her boundaries and wait. But her warning stuck with me. Whatever I was stepping into, it was deeper and more dangerous than I'd imagined. After leaving the apartment, I parked a few blocks away, trying to gather my thoughts. The brief encounter with the woman I was certain was my sister had left me reeling. Her guarded demeanor, the subtle flicker of recognition, everything pointed to her being the person I was looking for. Yet her cryptic warning lingered in my mind, a nagging reminder that my journey was far from over. As I replayed the conversation in my head, I noticed something strange. A dark sedan was parked across the street, its engine idling. The car hadn't been there when I arrived, and the tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. Brushing it off as paranoia, I drove back to my motel on the outskirts of the city. The room was sparse and unremarkable, but it felt like a refuge after the emotional intensity of the day. I placed the folder of documents and the locket on the small desk by the window, staring at them as if they might somehow offer clarity. The sound of a car engine outside snapped me out of my thoughts. Peering through the curtains, I saw the same dark sedan idling just a few doors down. My pulse quickened. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. I stepped away from the window, heart racing, and checked the locks on the door. Whoever was in that car wasn't just passing by, they were watching. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it someone from the adoptive family, catching wind of my search? Or could it be my father, manipulating events from the shadows? That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the motel's thin walls and every distant car engine set me on edge. By morning, the sedan was gone, but the unease remained. Determined to press forward, I returned to the apartment complex. The plan was simple: leave the sealed envelope and locket at the woman's door with a note explaining their significance. If she truly was my sister, she deserved to have them, even if she wasn't ready to meet me yet. As I approached the building, I noticed something chilling. The mailbox labeled L. Daniels was ajar, its lock broken. Inside was a stack of disheveled letters and a manila envelope marked with my grandmother's handwriting. Someone had been here, and they weren't looking for a friendly reunion. I left the items at her door, this time knocking firmly before stepping back to wait. Minutes passed in tense silence before the door creaked open. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously toward the street. She didn't take the envelope or locket but instead whispered a single word: leave. Her fear was unmistakable. Whatever danger she had warned me about was closer than I'd realized. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted. The drive back to the motel was tense, every car in my rearview mirror sending a fresh jolt of paranoia through me. The dark sedan hadn't reappeared, but the unease that had settled in my chest refused to lift. Whatever I had stumbled into, it wasn't just a family drama, it was something much more dangerous. When I reached the motel, I found the door to my room ajar. The sight stopped me cold. I scanned the parking lot, but no one was in sight. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The room had been ransacked. The desk where I'd left the locket and the folder was empty, papers scattered across the floor. The locket was gone. My heart sank as I frantically searched for the envelope containing my grandmother's documents. It was missing too. This wasn't random. Someone had been here, searching for something specific, and they had found it. I called Evelyn Clark, my grandmother's lawyer, as soon as I could. Her voice was calm but firm as I described the break-in and the missing items. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she confirmed my growing fear. The adoptive family had likely discovered my search and was now trying to protect their own secrets. Evelyn advised me to leave the city immediately. The documents and locket, while important, weren't the end of the trail. My grandmother had taken precautions, ensuring the most critical pieces of the inheritance were protected elsewhere. Still, the danger was undeniable, and staying any longer could put both my sister and me at greater risk. As I packed up my belongings, I couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman who had opened the door but refused to take the items I'd left. Her fear had been palpable, and now it made sense. She wasn't just wary of me, she was terrified of the shadow her adoptive family cast over her life. I decided to leave the city but not the fight. This wasn't over. My grandmother's work, her faith in me, and the truth about my sister demanded more. Before I left, I made one last stop, a public library. There, I found a quiet corner and wrote a letter to my sister. In it, I explained everything, about the inheritance, our grandmother's efforts to protect her, and the family she had unknowingly been caught up with. I left my contact information at the bottom, praying she would read it if it ever reached her. I mailed it to the apartment address, knowing it was a gamble. If she didn't receive it, or if she chose to ignore it, I'd have to accept that this was as far as I could go for now. As I drove out of the city, the road ahead felt both uncertain and full of purpose. I didn't know where the trail would lead next, but I knew one thing for sure. My grandmother had entrusted me with this mission, and I wasn't going to stop until the truth was uncovered and my sister was safe. 2 weeks passed after I left the city. Every day, I wondered if my letter would reach her, or if she'd even open it. The break-in and the missing documents had rattled me, but they also left me with a sharper sense of purpose. My grandmother's warnings about the adoptive family were no longer abstract, they were a very real threat. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed. The number was unrecognized, but something told me to answer. Her voice on the other end was quiet, cautious, but unmistakable. It was my sister. She didn't say much, only that she had read my letter and wanted to meet, somewhere public, somewhere safe. We agreed on a small diner in a neighboring town, a neutral place far from the city where she lived. When I arrived, she was already there, seated in the corner, her back to the wall. Her eyes darted around the room, but when they landed on me, there was something familiar in them, a connection I couldn't explain. Over coffee, the pieces finally fell into place. She confirmed that she had always known she was adopted but had no idea about the extent of the adoptive family's criminal ties. She had kept her distance from them for years, cutting off all contact, but their influence had a way of reaching her life no matter how far she tried to run. When I mentioned the stolen locket and documents, her expression hardened. She hadn't known about the inheritance or our grandmother's efforts to protect her, but it all made sense now. The break-in at her mailbox and the menacing figures lurking near her apartment weren't random. They were searching for the same answers I had been. Despite her initial fear, she agreed to accept the inheritance, not for the money, but for the protection it offered. Together, we decided to work with Evelyn Clark, who helped us navigate the legal labyrinth my grandmother had created. The process wasn't easy. The adoptive family's reach extended further than we imagined, and their attempts to disrupt our efforts grew increasingly bold. One night, a threatening letter arrived at Evelyn's office. It was unsigned, but the message was clear: stop pursuing the inheritance or face the consequences. For the first time, my sister considered walking away. But I couldn't let her. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore, it was about reclaiming the life her grandmother had wanted for her. With Evelyn's help, we secured the assets, transferred the ownership of the lake house, and locked down the funds in an untouchable trust. My sister moved into the lake house, where its secluded location and built-in security systems finally gave her the peace she'd been searching for. As for me, the journey had changed everything. The truth about my family, my sister, and my grandmother's hidden strength reshaped the way I saw my own life. My father never resurfaced, and perhaps that was for the best. Some bridges didn't need rebuilding. The last time I visited the lake house, my sister and I sat by the water as the sun set. She held the locket in her hand, her thumb brushing over its engraved surface. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. I told her the truth. I did it because family mattered, even when it was fractured, messy, and painful. Our grandmother had believed in both of us, and that was enough. As the waves lapped against the shore, the weight of the past finally began to lift.